Okay, Reverend Liggin. So let's talk about why you did what you did with regards to the movement in Clarksville.
As we focused on the year 1963, it was a year of change, and we were promoters of change. And of course, the main question was, why did we do what we did? Well, first of all, we have to find out what was our problem. Lamel Carter, the Reverend Lamel Carter, who was a pastor of the CME Church, made a report at the Citizens Committee on Local Affairs, which was held at Ebenezer AME Church. And in his report, he tells of the state of the colored community in Clarksville. And in telling this story, he reveals that there was no chance for improvement, economic improvement in that community because people were frozen on their jobs. If you had a job, you could not change it without your employer's permission to get a better job. You just couldn't go. And if you were going for better money, he wasn't going to release you. And he wasn't going to let somebody else hire you. And that was understood, and all the employers played by that game. And the next thing was that there were no openings in the businesses. The blacks were either going to be laborers, they were going to be farm hands, or domestic servants. That was the only thing open. Now you could shop, but you couldn't work where you spent your money. And so that told us where we had to focus our attention. We were playing it by ear because we'd never been in this place before, and everything was new and experimental. We could hear what others were doing, but we were in a different city, in a different location. We had to tailor our activities for our city. One of the things that we figured out was everything was about money. From 1860, I went to the research, found that there were about over 3 million slaves, and they were worth over $4 billion. So slavery was big money. And of course, they were trying hard after the Civil War to kind of keep that thing going, although slavery had been abolished. They were trying to rebuild their economic status. But so one of the things that they did was they allowed the slaves to make some money, but the money always ended up in their pockets because there were no black businesses permitted of any, of any number. So we could buy, but we couldn't work where we bought. So one of the things that came out of our meeting of minds was to cause change by managing the money. Cut the money off. So we were able to get our neighbors and friends, relatives, to stop buying where you couldn't work. Cut the money off. So once we stopped the flow of money and we had to buy outside of the city, anywhere outside of that community was permissible. And once we were able to cut the money off, the businessmen were ready to come to the table. And that happened at the climax of our program at Shoney's. all of this was going on at the same time. And so, but by the time the governor came into the picture, because he heard that there was a little stirring at Fort Campbell, and that some of our memberships, we had members who were stationed at Fort Campbell, and some of them had been able to gather and unite a large enough group to come to our rescue when we were struggling for change.
Now these were members, your members were?
The members of some of, I'm thinking about those who were members of Ebenezer AME Church. And not only were some of these church members, but some of them happened to be in a class that came from Florida A&M, a graduating class of ROTC. And these were all military officers, Army officers, a whole class, and all of them were Kappas, members of Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity. And so when they learned that I was a Kappa, I was going to be their host pastor. And so they came to my church. And so they were stationed only a few miles away. We were inside of Clarksville. They were at Fort Campbell, only a few miles away. And so they made Ebenezer their home church while they were encamped at Fort Campbell. And while we were in the midst of struggle, they prepared to come and rescue us. But when the governor heard the word, he called me. I was at the mayor's office trying to negotiate for change. And the governor called and offered his help. And by him intervening, calling the owner of the Shawnee chain, everything began to change. And once they dropped their program of segregation for the whole chain, then the other businesses fell in suit. Overnight, they began to hire out of our community people to serve as clerks and whatnot in the local businesses. And then things began to change.
What was the first significant change that you can recall that was particular to a certain industry or the black entrepreneurship in the township?
Well, I noticed even some of the people in my church decided to try. I know my associate pastor decided that he would try to open his own business. I had a struggling grocery store, and so I decided to devote all of my time just to my ministry, and I gave the store over to him. And so he entered in, and he stayed in the business for a number of years. And so I had a grocery and a gasoline pump. And so we didn't do any big business, but we did some business. We did a struggling business. And then I noticed that something else that was interesting, that people who had lived below the poverty level began to struggle for a change in their lifestyle. And I thought, like many middle-class people, that they were happy like they were. You know, people made adjustments and they seemed happy. But when they got an opportunity to make a change, they changed their lifestyle and they began to move upward. And that was a big surprise to me. I don't know how it affected others, but I was really surprised that they were not comfortable staying in poverty, and they began to struggle to improve their lifestyle and their living conditions and the opportunities for their children. And so you could see them making a change. And even the slums became out of style, and the people began to live in better living conditions.
So in Clarksville, what was the major industry or an engine that turned it from this small town to now, a bigger, more progressive town?
Yeah, it was mainly a farming community, and the people of my congregation had been farmers and still were doing some farming, and but the city, one of the biggest industries was the Frosty Marn Meatpacking Company. That was a big business, and largest employer was Fort Campbell Military Base, home of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. That was a big thing in Montgomery County. And so they employed a lot of people, plus we had access to all of the military income coming into the area.
What kind of conversation did you and Governor Clement have when you spoke with him?
Well, the major thing that we did was to try to see if we could could be successful in eliminating any kind of violence. One of the things that was in the picture that I haven't talked about was the presence of the Ku Klux Klan, and it was a violent military operation. That's what stirred up the paratroopers, was the presence of the Klan. And so whenever we would be out doing our non-violent demonstrations, we would be surrounded by the Klan. And so in our discussion with the governor and the mayor of the city and the county judge, the idea was for each of us to control whatever segment of the population that we could. I was responsible for the black community, and they were responsible for the other sections under their jurisdictions. And so we were successful because we did not major in using children in the demonstration. That was the outstanding thing about the work in Montgomery County and Clarksville in particular. We did not use children to do the work of adults. We were able to get about 2/3 of the adult community to be with us as we did our demonstrations for better conditions in the area. So we had primarily a grown-up operation, and that made a very big an impression when people looked out and saw folks that had worked for them trying to redress the bad things that were happening in their society. That made a big difference, because they weren't dealing with children, they were dealing with grown-ups. And so that made a strong impression, and it made a faster change, because our changes work faster in that county than anywhere else that I'm aware of.
Talk about your role as galvanizing the African Americans to vote, and in particular vote for Lyndon B. Johnson.
Okay. Now, in getting our folks together was a hard thing, since separation is what keeps us from being affected. People kept us separated, and the power structure counted on us being divided. I had a secretary by the name of Estelle Jenkins. Mrs. Jenkins was an excellent ex-secretary. And what we could not get our activities in the local newspaper. So what we did was we put out a weekly bulletin, and I kept it like a digest. When I did my editorials, I kept them short, like you found in Jet magazine. And it was not a lot of reading. Everything was in a nutshell, so that they could. All we wanted them to get the information and the idea in as brief a delivery as possible. And we spread that our bulletins were in all the beauty parlors and barbershops and stores and churches and lodges, places where our folks gathered, beer gardens, and they read it, and they got the instructions and the information and the idea and a sense of the direction in which we wanted to go. And that's how we galvanized that black community. And even in the white community, they were reading that bulletin every week. They were going to the places where it was being distributed and grabbing up the copies so that they would know what was going on. And so information, correct information, is always essential. And even though we didn't at that time have access to the main avenues of communication, I did have a radio broadcast. That was a big help. Over the local radio station, I was able to buy time, and I did a broadcast. That's what attracted the Kappas to my congregation. They heard me and my presentation, and they liked what they heard. I not only gave a sermon, but I also gave information and updates on what was going on. And that attracted this class of officers to that congregation. And so that was a big help in pulling everybody together as a team. The other thing that I want to mention is that we organized this Citizens Committee on Local Affairs, which represented every kind of group that was in the city, every kind of group, regardless of what the class and status. Everybody was represented. And that way, everybody had something to offer. My theology and my philosophy was everybody has something to bring to the table. And so nobody was overlooked, nobody was left out, nobody was ignored. And so that was a big thing in pulling us together and helping us to succeed in bringing about change.
So one of the other changes that you mentioned is how Lyndon B. Johnson's administration, the Labor Department, gave Ebenezer a grant. Talk about that and what resulted from that.
Okay. Lyndon B. Johnson, after the murder of John Kennedy, took over the reins, and then he ran for office. In running for office, he promoted this war on poverty, which did not sit well with the conservative community. And they did not support Lyndon B. Johnson in that city and county. But I did. So I began my first amateur struggle in politics. And I began to organize the community to support Lyndon B. Johnson. We did not ask the Democrat Party for money. We raised our own money, and we paid our own workers, and we put them on the street from door to door. And we were successful. As a matter of fact, the old line Democrats had another candidate that they were supporting in the place of Lyndon Johnson, and we outran them. We outvoted them. And so the more progressive party carried the county and the city. And when Lyndon B. Johnson was elected, he did not forget us. And one of the things that happened that was exciting was that a young man who was running for office had my support. He did not win the office he ran for, but because he did so well, with our help, Lyndon B. Johnson took him into his cabinet, and he worked under Sergeant Shriver, and he had information on all the grants that were coming forth. And when our city applied for a number of grants to update and improve their city, they didn't think about us, the black community. But I got a telephone call from Lyndon Johnson's office, and the young man that I had supported in the election called to give me an update. And I found out that there was money coming into the community if I could get our part. And I was advised to go to the mayor's office and do an inquiry. And when I got there and I inquired, they said yes, they had their proposals in, and the next day they would be sent to Washington. And so I told them that I was calling Washington and telling them to stop the whole thing. Don't send any money unless we were included. And they said, oh no, Reverend Liggin, don't do that. We'll include you if you can get your proposal in in the morning. So I had to drink tea that night and stay up and write a proposal. And I wrote a grant to support young people, the training of young people in child care. And my grant was included, my proposal was included, and I got a sizable grant that allowed me to hire and to train and to educate a group of young people for employment. And we were able to employ out of that class some of the best students, those who wanted to work. We were able to keep them on. And so that worked out very well. Now that was the first thing. Then another grant came across. The most exciting thing came across was that the city Board of Education had designed a program for men who were unemployed and they were not qualified for work that was available. And they were able to get from the Department of Labor a grant for a class of machinists. And they needed 2 teachers. They needed one to teach the academics and one to teach the trade. And they found a young man who was not college trained, but he was a machinist. And he was going to teach the machine shop. And because I had a teaching certificate, I was able to get the job teaching the academics, reading, writing, and math. And so that went over big. I knew how to get to the employers and introduce my students to them and get a commitment that they would hire. Oh, the most interesting thing was that they threw me a curve. They thought uh, I would lose interest in the opportunity to teach the class when they told me that most of the men in the class were members of the Klan. And so there were 18, there was 17 whites and 3 blacks in this class. 17 whites and 3 blacks. And all the whites had been members of the Klan. And so they asked me, could I handle it? I said, if they're men, I can handle it. So, and I went in and introduced myself and told them that we were getting ready to try a journey and it would be successful if they wanted it that way. I told them my name is Mr. Liggin, and I answer to that, and I'm going to treat you with respect and give you a chance for upward bound. And they turned out well. As a matter of fact, they became a delightful group to work with. And they introduced me to their families, and it worked well. And the men, and those who graduated were able to get good jobs, and their lives changed. We had one young man who had trained in an earlier class who was black, and he was a former member of the U.S. Navy, and he was unemployed, and he was impoverished, and he was just struggling, and he was related to the families of my church, but when the opportunity came and the door opened, and they were looking for a machinist who happened to be black, he was the only one who fit the prescription, and he got the job. And overnight, he went from living as a homeless person to having a nice place for his family and able to keep his children in school, to dress them, and even owned a nice car. I think he bought a new car. And I was surprised to see that change in a person who was able to see the American dream come his way. And also that was a beautiful experience.
So we sort of touched upon some of the Jim Crow attitudes that were in Clarksville. Did that continue to go on, or how was that dealt with once things started to open up?
Actually, Clarksville was a beautiful surprise and an excellent example of what can happen in America if you want to try. Because it's a beautiful place to live in. It's one of the growing cities in Tennessee. It's improved in many ways. The living conditions are better. The opportunities are abundant. And the fellowship among people is very good. And so it changed for the better. It didn't stagnate, it improved. And even though people they thought they were set in their way, they didn't anticipate changing, those who were in the power structure, but they went along with change, and the city has done remarkable things. And then being a university city, Austin Peay State University is located in that city. And of course, it has had its bearing on the changes, I'm sure, that have come that way. Not to say anything least about Fort Campbell. And Fort Campbell was able because they were working with a lot of people. As a matter of fact, I guess there were more people on the base than there were in the city. And so they could control what happened to their group. And that was a big plus, because for the city to have the patronage of the military, they had to make sure that everything worked well, and that the men who were coming to do business were treated fairly, and so you could see the change when housing was poor, and the military were being taken advantage of. Fort Campbell built their own community of standard housing. And so people no longer went to the city to live in old chicken houses that was fixed up to live in. They got rid of that. And they ceased to do that, ceased to practice that. And because they had to compete with Fort Campbell, which was willing to provide standard housing for their personnel. And so the idea of anything goes and substandard houses is enough, that ceased to be.
So raising two daughters in Clarksville at such an early age, what was that like under the circumstances that were occurring?
Well, but the first two were girls, second two were boys. All of them, Karen was born in Louisville, Katrina was born in Louisville, Carl was born in Louisville, Fred was born in Clarksville. But they were all children in Clarksville. And so that brought in the school, and the school was not a part of our effort to change things in the beginning. We didn't try to change the school. We didn't try to integrate the school. As a matter of fact, the negative part of our leadership was among the school people, because they didn't want to lose their jobs. And so you can understand that they were a little hesitant about working along with us. But we had one teacher, one professor named Mr. James Urey, a very brilliant gentleman who taught in the high school there. And Mr. Urey was a big help, because he was a good thinker. And when we were trying to think through our situations and make sure that we did the right things and the lawful things, Mr. James Urey was on board to help us. And so he was one of the only teachers that I can remember. There was one other man by the name of Mr. Joseph Roberts, was also a teacher. And so Joseph Roberts worked with the young people, and he marshaled them during the days that we worked in demonstrations. We never had them out where they would be in danger of fire hoses and police dogs and harassment by Klansmen. Our young people were never injected to that. And but they had their own activities. They had things that they did. When we had a procession of cars going into areas where we were filling up parking places to keep people out of businesses. We come in, fill up the parking lot. We would have a whole line of cars. And every car was filled with people. There's a line of cars as far as you could see. And they would come in, fill up the parking lot where your business was dead for that day because every parking space was taken. And people would pull out, our people would pull in. And we just stopped it. We stopped everything. There was no movement at all. And so we were able to call for negotiation. Yes.
And these teachers you're speaking of, were they African Americans or were they
African American teachers? Both these teachers, Mr. Uri and Mr. Roberts, both were teachers, African American teachers.
So in Clarksville at this time, were all the teachers at the black schools African American?
Yeah, we had black schools and white schools. We had two systems, a black school system and a white. Now, at the close of when everything changed over, there was a question came up about the schools. I was invited to speak to a group of women in a women's organization. I think they were the wives of the police. There was an auxiliary to the police department. And they called me to talk to them about the educational system. And they said to me that the children, they're talking about white children now, were not getting a fair chance at the best jobs in the community because the schools across the state line, we were right on the state line, were producing better students, better graduates. And they would come across the line out of Kentucky into Tennessee and get the jobs that their children couldn't because our schools were not producing what the employers wanted. They're not talking about black children, talking about white children. And so they asked me, would I help them? And so we developed a fellowship and we began to see what could be done. And I became a member of the PTA. And we ended up with a change in the entire school system where both the black and white were integrated, the city and the county were integrated. And they upgraded the school and built from the ground up brand new schools. And that was an interesting pursuit. And this became the pattern for the school that was built later in Alcoa, Tennessee. They came to Clarksville and got the pattern for the school they wanted to build in Alcoa.
So in 1962, when Miss Lois Jean Liggin, your wife, became indirectly involved as an educator, talk about that.
My wife was teaching in the Louisville school system at Escoridge Taylor Elementary School. My father was the principal of Escoridge Taylor. So she got her first year of training in his facility. And I preceded her in Clarksville. She came a few months later with a family, with the children, 2 girls. And once she got to Clarksville, she was hired by the Montgomery County school system. And she taught there until the birth of Carl my son Carl. And she came back to Louisville to give birth to him. And on her return, I was caught up in leadership of the Civil Rights Organization, which I was kind of maneuvered into it by some of the older pastors who didn't wish to take the responsibility. And being naive, I thought it was a great honor to be out there in leadership, not realizing that I was being moved into that position deliberately. At any rate, my wife had been teaching successfully, and then once I got into leadership, she was no longer needed, and I asked her to take over my daycare, which was small, and she came in to work it. She had her degree in elementary education, and she was an unusually talented person at the development of daycare. She was masterful at it. And that daycare grew from a half a dozen children to over 100. It became the largest black daycare in the community. She taught the children before they were in first grade reading readiness and number readiness. And by the time they were ready for first grade, they were already ahead of them. They were reading and writing and doing arithmetic. And they were ahead of the first graders. They were really the envy of all the persons in the educational field, because our kids came ready. If we had not been a black daycare, we could have gotten the children from the white community. But you know, there would have been a stigma in coming to anything black. So, but at any rate, we were the best. And I can say that because my wife was the best. She was really good. She was an asset. And so, as I always say, everybody brings something to the table. And that was my wife's particular skill, was working with children. And even problem children. She could take problem children and put them in line. And so we had an unusually great operation. And she continued that until I left the area. I left in 1967. 1967 was the year that I went to Alcoa. And the interesting thing was that even though I had delivered to my community a better economic situation, I was an unwanted entity, and they put a contract on me. And so I was to be eliminated one way or the other. One man who had influence with the bishop was able to get the bishop to move me from the church I had to a smaller church in the county. The city was divided on whether I should go or stay. A president of one of the banks told me that I could stay as long as I wanted, and he would see that I had the money to do what I wanted to do. He said the money was available to build me a new home on the lot. I had a acre on a hilltop. And he said the money was available to build a house. And if I wanted to build me a church, the money was available to build a church. And I could stay as long as I wanted to. And it was so tempting. But at the same time, the assassin who had the contract only lived a block away from me. And the fellow who was in the underworld tipped me off to who had the contract. The thing that made me an undesirable neighbor was that in '67, as I was at the end of my tenure in the city, I really liked the city. In '67, the AFL-CIO decided to move in to two plants. There was two plants. One was Frosty Mart Meat Packing Company and another company. And they were coming in to organize. And I got the blame for their arrival, which I wasn't in on that. But young men who had grown up in my church were the leaders of it, unbeknown to me. They did it. So it was just about the same as me doing it, since they grew up under me. And so they led the company. I discovered it when I went to Chattanooga for a business meeting of the church. There was a Mr. Archie Griffin Sr., who became my presiding elder later. He lived in Chattanooga, but he was also a officer in the AFL-CIO. And he was instructed in a meeting that in Clarksville, they put a contract on a man who was creating problems, and that they wanted to stop the union from coming in. And so I was marked because they thought I was the one who brought the union in. And so my time was up. But, and I went peacefully. To my new field of labor. But the companies came in and the standards grew and other businesses came into the city, and the city began to just kind of burst at the seams. And so it ceased to be a country town to really a growing progressive city. It's a metropolitan type of city now. It's a place where people desire to live and to go, both black and white.